Let's move on to CSS transforms, transitions, and animations. And before we finish today, we'll make a CSS only animated hamburger icon and drop-down nav menu as you see here. Let's look at our starter code today. You can see I've got an index.html file, and inside this index.html file, I've just got a main element, and it contains 3 divs. I don't usually use divs, but for this example, they're good. We're just creating squares with all of them, and you can see I have a class of square set on each one. The final div also has a class of animate. And then I've got a different emoji inside of each div. And then in the file tree, you can see I've got some other files as well. But for these first examples of transforms, transitions, and animations, I'm just going to use the index.html file and then the style.css file. After this, though, we will go ahead and create an animated mobile menu, and it will have an animated hamburger icon as well as the drop-down navigation menu inside of it. But for now, let's just learn about the basics of transforms, transitions, and animations. Now, inside of the style.css file, you can see I'm importing the Nunito font from Google. I've got a basic CSS reset here. Inside the HTML element styles, I've set the font just a little larger to 1.5 rems, and we're applying the Nunito font that we've imported. And then the body element is set to a min height of 100 viewport units. It's a display of flex and a column. So the main element that's inside of the body is set to flex grow 1. So it also extends to the full visible page that we see the body take up. And from there, the main element is also set to display flex for anything within it, and it's set to a column as well, and everything is centered, and then there will be a gap of 1 rem between the flex items within the main element. And those flex items are the 3 divs that we previously looked at inside of the HTML file. They've got a width and a height of 200 pixels, so they're squares. They've got a border of 1 pixel solid black, and then I set each one to display grid so we could center the content easily just by saying place content center, so it centers those emojis. I'll drag our code over to the left side of the screen, and we can see this page right now with our starter code here on the right. We've got our 3 divs, each one is 200 by 200 pixels, and then we've centered the emoji inside of each one. Now we're ready to apply some individual styles to each of these divs. So I'm going to scroll for some more room inside of the CSS file. I'm also going to press Control-B to hide the file tree so I have a little more room to type. And we'll review some pseudo class selectors to select each one of these divs. So first I'll put in div in lowercase, and then the first pseudo class I'm going to use is first child. So this should select the first div, and we can test that by changing the color. Change the background color to Dodger Blue and save, and using the live server extension, it updates automatically when we save, and we can see that first div gets a background color of Dodger Blue. So I'm going to highlight this div selector and press Shift Alt and the down arrow twice so I get it twice more inside of our code, and then I can just change this to nth child, and then we need a parentheses, and I'll put in the number 2, and now I'll switch the second div to yellow, and then finally we can use last child for the last div, and we just need 1 S, there we go, and I'll change this one to lime green. So now let's save and see if the colors change, and they do. So we've successfully selected all 3 of these divs individually now. The first property we'll look at is transform. So inside of the first child, I'll select that and use transform. And then what we'll put in for a value first is translate X. You can see we have different choices here that Visual Studio Code gives us. Now X will move it left or right. And if we use percents, it bases the percent on the size of the div. So when I put in 50%, it should move it halfway over, and we can compare to the other divs to see if this is correct. And yes, it moves our first div 50% of the way over of the width of the div, not of the page or the element that it's within, but of the element itself. So that is the 50%, and the positive number moves it to the right. A negative number would move it to the left. Now we can use other units besides percents, so in the next div I'll say transform once again, And then I'll use translate Y, which should move it up or down. And here I'll use 2 rem, and let's see what happens. It moved it down 2 rem. So likewise, if I give it a negative 2 rem, it should move it up. And as you might have guessed, instead of just translate X or translate Y, we can use the shorthand and use them together. So on the third one, I'll say transform, and then I'll just use translate. And now the first value is the X value. So I'll say 100%, and we can combine different units. So here I'll say minus 2 rem and save. And now you can see it moves it to the right 100%. And then the minus 2 rem did move it up. So now we're back to our original gap between the second div and the third div, because we also moved that second div minus 2 rem. So if we were to just switch this to translate X and then remove the minus 2 rem, you can see that the gap is larger. So if we wanted to move this up even more to make it obvious, I could just delete the translate X, go back to translate, and let's say minus 5 rem and save, and now you can see it moves way up, so it's a little easier to see that it's working. So we now know that translate X moves things left and right, and translate Y moves things up and down, and we can use them both together. But for now, let's just comment these out. So I'll press Shift Alt and the letter A to comment them out after I have highlighted them, and do that for the third one as well. And we'll move on to the next value that we can use for transform, which is rotate. So I'll once again put in transform, and I'm going to leave these commented out values in here so you can play around with them from my source code if you want to. So this transform will be rotate, and you can see once again we have choices like X, Y, and Z, so I'm going to choose X. And now let's say rotate 180 degrees, and this will of course apply to the first one, and when I save, these other changes will revert because we've commented them out too. So there we have now rotated 180 degrees. Let's do a smaller rotation and you can see what happens as well. So something looks a little strange about this box, doesn't it? That's because it's rotating from the top backwards. So it's kind of like a pizza box if you consider it that way. This bottom part is coming towards you and the top part is moving away from you as far as that rotation. And that means once we get to 90 degrees, it disappears because you are now at eye level with that flat top, or the card. Consider this a card as well instead of just a pizza box, and you're flipping it over from the top. And so once we go 180 degrees, it is flipped all the way over, and now notice the rocket is pointing to the bottom right instead of the top right, and that's because that card has been flipped over from top to bottom. So as you might guess then, if we apply transform and then rotate Y, let's choose that out of our list here. And now if we set this to, say, 45 degrees, so we can see what's happening first, it will be just the opposite. So this now looks a little skinnier because we're flipping it, I believe, from left to right. Let's go ahead and do the 180. And yes, now the flame is just the opposite. So we took the right side and made it the left side, but it's flipped over. So imagine having the same image on both sides, but it's the opposite of that. So we're flipping this side to this side, and then of course what was here over to this side. So we're seeing this from the back as if the image was burned all the way through. And so left to right would be the way to consider Y as far as the rotation, and top to bottom would be the way to consider X for the rotation. And now let's apply one more down here to our final div. So we'll say transform, and now we'll use rotate Z. And let's go ahead and choose 90 degrees with rotate Z and see what happens. It didn't disappear, did it? It turned. So we did have our taco facing the normal way, and now it is turned over here. So this might be clockwise. Let's see what happens if we do 180. Yes, and now it's upside down. So that's actually what this is doing, is rotating clockwise with a positive number. A negative number, of course, would take it counterclockwise. It's worth noting that although we can use rotate Z, it is just the same as if we just said rotate. So if I save this, we won't see a change. Likewise, if we make it 135 degrees, it'll move on around. And yes, we did see the change now. You can tell it rotated because of the taco has a different position here in the middle. But we could put this some odd number as well, and it won't have such a perfect rotation to see the change. So there we once again go. It does rotate the full box, not just the emoji. Okay, I'll once again comment these out, but leave them in the code. So if you do download the source code, you can see these in there. And we're going to move on to the next possible transformation, and that's going to be scale. It's very useful at times. I meant for this to be on the same line here for the comment. Okay, for scale, we'll say transform once again, and then we'll say scale X, as you might guess, and let's make this 120% and see what happens to this top box. It got bigger, but only to the left and the right, as with X, which is a lot like the translate X, but now it just grew to 120% of the size, but it only expanded on the horizontal plane here to the left and the right, not up and down at all. So as you might guess, if we apply the opposite to the second div, transform Y, transform, and then we need actually scale Y, there we go. Put that at 120%. We'll see the growth goes to the top and the bottom, and it doesn't expand on the left and the right at all. And finally, if we look at this last child, and now I'm going to scroll for just a little room, I'll put in transform once again, and here I'll just put scale. And like translate, we can put in both the X and the Y value. So I'll say 50% X and 50% Y and save. And we can see instead of growing, it actually shrank because it's just half the size that it was. Now, before we finish with transform, there is one more possible thing to cover with it, and I'll comment all of these out as well. And what we want to do there, it's called skew. Oops, I selected that below. There it is. And now one more to select before we move on to transform skew. So now, once again, on this first div, we'll say transform, and we'll say skew X. And with that, we'll say minus 10 degrees, and let's see what happens. And you can see now we've got a leaning box instead of the normal box that we had. And that's kind of cool sometimes when you want to get that effect. Now let's do the opposite with Y. So transform, and then we'll say skew, if I could spell skew correctly. And here we'll once again say a degree, but let's choose a different value, maybe minus 10 degrees instead of 10. No, we said minus 10 before. Maybe I should go 10 degrees. Let me go ahead and try that. And yeah, we can see we get the opposite if we use a positive number instead of the negative, but we skewed this Y also. So it's leaning a little differently than this one here on the top, where the sides tilted. Now the top lines tilted, at the top and the bottom actually, instead of the left and the right. And finally, as we did with scale and translate, we can provide both in the same. So transform, and now we'll just say skew instead of skew X or Y. And here I'll say minus 10 degrees. And now I'll stick with minus 10 degrees here as well. And when we save, we can see that applies to both. So it's leaning on the left and the right, and the lines have changed on the top and the bottom as well. Now, I've touched on some of the basic uses with all of these transformations, and there are many more that you can reference in MDN. And so, as always, I'm putting the MDN link for transform and all of these different possibilities in the course description inside of the resources. So you'll find that on GitHub when you go to the course resources. And now that we've covered everything you can do with transform, I'll reset these back, and we're going to start looking at transitions. Let's apply a transition to when we hover over the divs. So we'll say div and then use our pseudo class selector hover. And then inside of this, we'll change the background color when we hover over. That will be easy to tell. And let's use the color midnight blue. Next, we need to provide the transition property that we are changing, and that is the background dash color. From there, let's set the transition dash duration, and we'll set that to 2 seconds and save. So now, when we mouse over one of these, I'll do the middle one. It takes 2 seconds and it changes to midnight blue. The same with the top and the same with the bottom. Now we can also provide a transition dash delay. There it is. Let's set this to just a half second. We don't want to wait too long. And now when I mouse over, it doesn't change immediately, but then it starts to. So it waits that half second first. Now this is important to know. If you put two transitions together, that transition delay does not go between the transitions. It's just before it starts. So we have a half second delay, and then it goes ahead and does the 2-second transition to Midnight Blue. Now I mentioned having a second transition or a second transform that we're providing here. So let's go ahead and do one other pseudo selector. I'll say div hover again, but now we'll only apply this to the last child. Actually, I need to say last child first and then hover. There we go. Now for this, I'll say transform, and we'll just rotate, and let's rotate 180 degrees. So this would just apply to the last one, but we don't have a transition applied to that yet either. But we can up here if we want to in these same lines. So after background color, I can just put a comma and say transform. And then during the duration, if I want that to be a different duration, I can just say 3 seconds here. And then if I don't want a delay, or I want the same delay, I could just leave it as is. So let's just leave it as is. So we've got background color 2 seconds, transform 3 seconds, and we'll save. And now if I hover over this last one, it waits that half second, and then it begins to rotate. And notice it takes 3 seconds to rotate, but only 2 seconds to change colors. Once I'll do this again, you can see the color is fully changed before it stops rotating. Okay, but that is a lot of different lines here. We've got transition property, transition duration, transition delay, and as you might guess, there is a shorthand. So I'm going to comment all of those out with Shift Alt and the letter A, and now I'm just going to say transition. And here I can say all of the transitions instead of any specific one. I'll say I want them all to last 2 seconds and all of them to have a half second delay. And I can save that and handle it all in one line. So now when I mouse over, it just takes 2 seconds and it finishes. These still apply the same, just a 2-second switch to the color. Now we can also provide a timing function here, and there are some definitions or other ones that are already defined essentially that we can put in here. So the default is ease, but we could also put in some others. Let's go ahead and set this up by saying transition, and now let's see, timing function. This is what we would be looking for. A lot of different values that could go in here, but the default is ease. But once I start typing ease, you can also see there's ease in and out, or just ease out. Now what this means, and I usually can't tell much of a difference between ease and ease in and out, but it starts slow and then it speeds up, and then once again it slows down at the end. So I'll just choose ease even though that's the default, and let's go ahead and look at this now. Well, we can see more in the rotation. So it starts slow, it speeds up, and it ends slow. Now the opposite of that would be to say linear. So it does everything at an even pace, and now you can see it just, there's not a huge difference, but there's a little bit of difference. So you can provide this function, and if you do so, you can provide it right here after how long the transition will take. So right here is where we might say linear, and of course move this comment over here and save. And now this should still apply the linear. See, it's not as fast as the ease. I kind of like the ease, or let's try ease in and out and see if we notice much of a change. I don't usually, but let's see what we get. It does speed up and slows back down. So I do like that a little bit better personally than linear, but both are available. And remember, if you don't apply one, ease on its own is the default. So even if we didn't say ease in and out or linear or anything, and we just left it as this, it would apply the ease timing function as is. Now we've learned about transform and transitions that can help us make a little more impact with the transformations. Let's scroll for some more room and now learn about animations. That's just a little different. So I'm going to go ahead and start defining the class animate. If you remember, we applied this class to this last div inside of the HTML. So for animate, the first thing we need to do is name our animation. So we should have animation dash name, and here I'm just going to name this slide. Then an animation dash duration, and I'll give this 5 seconds. An animation, let's spell that correctly again, timing function, and thank goodness Visual Studio Code helps me spell. Here I'll say ease in and out. So you can see this is a lot like a transition so far, but you will notice a difference as well. And we can provide an animation delay. Let's delay this by 1 second. That's just a little bit longer. We can also give an animation iteration count. So I'm going to have it repeat this animation 5 times. Now let's go ahead and just go with those properties for now, but this in itself won't apply the animation. We need to define keyframes for the animation. So we say at keyframes, and then we need to have an identifier here, and the identifier is the animation name slide. So now inside of this, we'll say at 0%, essentially at the beginning of the animation, we will transform, and then we'll translate X. And here inside of translate X, I'll just say 0. So we're starting at square one. We're not doing anything right when it begins. But then at 33%, or 1/3 of the way through, we'll once again say transform. And now I'll say translate X. And we'll move this 600 pixels to the right. So this will probably go way off the screen. And then we'll rotate 180 degrees. And notice there's no comma between those, which is strange, but that's the way it likes it in CSS. So we'll just leave it like that. After that, I'm going to highlight this and do Shift Alt and the down arrow. We'll change this 33 to a 66. So now we're 2/3 of the way through. And now I'll switch this to a -600 pixels and a -180 degrees. So we're applying more than one thing here. Again, no comma. And then finally we'll get to 100%. And at 100%, I'm going to go ahead and say transform, and our translate X once again will be back to the 0 position. And after that, let's change the background color when we get to the final position to Rebecca Purple. And there will be a reason we want to see this and how it changes. So notice now it started animating right when I saved. It didn't wait for a hover. It's an animation. And let me go ahead and pull this over to the full screen so we can see the full animation. And there's at least 3. Now notice it changes back to green when the animation starts again, and that's something else to discuss. But let's go ahead and let it finish the 5 times, and you can see it's going the 600 pixels in each direction. It's rotating as we want it to, and it changes colors at the end. But then it changes back to green, and it's back in that starting state. So since we have a smaller screen over here, let's maybe change these to 300. It'll probably still make it to the edge or beyond of the screen, but we'll leave it at that. And then let's go ahead and add some more animation properties above. And the next one that I want to add is the animation direction. Now the default here is just normal, but that's not exactly what we have to choose. So let's get those back up here, and there's alternate, alternate, reverse, reverse. Let's say alternate. So that means it's going to go forward the first time, and then it's going to reverse the next time. So when I save this, it will start again. Had that 1 second delay. Yeah, it went a little to the left, a little to the right, and then it stops. Now it went to the left instead of the right first, back to the right, and stops, and so on. So now we've seen those changes. The next property to look at is animation fill mode. So we'll say animation fill mode. And now what happens here is we are talking about the actual ending state. So the default is backwards, as you see Visual Studio Code brings up, and that means it goes back to the original state. It now has that green background again. But if we say forwards, when it stops, it should now go to that other state. And I'm going to shorten this up. So here we'll save it. So it goes forward once and then backwards once, and then we'll be at the ending state. So there was our forward. Now we go backward. But when we get to the very end, let's see if it goes back to green or not. Well, it did because we alternated. So let's switch this alternation back to normal, because it was the opposite when it did the alternate the second time. So there we end at purple, then it goes back to green and starts again, and now we're back to purple, and it stayed purple. That's the point of this animation fill mode. Since we set it to forwards instead of backwards, it keeps the ending state, so it stayed purple. Now again, there are some other animation properties that you can dive into the MDN link that I'm going to leave in the course resources, because there's a lot more you can do. I'm just touching on the basics here today. But once again, look at how many properties we had to use, and we can use shorthand instead of all those. So I will comment all of those out, and now let's just apply the shorthand. We'll say animation. That's going to last 5 seconds. Let's use ease in and out, and then we'll say 1 second delay, and then let's do the animation twice. Let's say normal, so it does it the same way both times, and then the ending state will be forwards, and the animation name, of course, we have to provide, and that is slide. So if we do that, this should apply the same as we had all of these properties above, but this is shorthand, so you can see how all of these values fit into that one shorthand line here for animation. Now we've completed the basics about transformations, transitions, and animations. So let's go ahead and begin working on that animated mobile nav menu that will give us an animated hamburger icon and animated drop-down menu that users could apply. So to do that, we need to look at our other starter code. I'm going to show the file tree again. I'm also going to stop live server for now because we'll launch a different HTML file. And I'm going to drag this back over to the full window. And then we'll look at the menu.html. This will also be in your starter code. And for the menu HTML, we have got a basic page here, but there's a little more than in the previous example. We have a header element inside of the body. And you can see this header element has a section inside of it, and it has the class header title line. And here we have our H1 that says Acme Co. And then we have a button as well. And inside this button is a div, and it has the class menu icon. The button has the class menu button. And then we have a nav element, and inside the nav element is an unordered list with 4 list items. Now they are basically fake links with just the hashtag that you would use as an anchor for the same page, but I am going ahead and passing one link to a products page, and this products page is basically just like the menu.html page, but of course it links back to the menu.html page just so we can see the difference there. I have absolutely nothing in the main element. This is all about the header and creating the menu around this header structure. So from there, let me close this style CSS and the index.html. Let's look at the menu CSS that is being imported and what we have for starter code before we really start animating this menu. So what we have again is the import of the font, basic CSS reset, and then we're setting 2 CSS variables just for the colors that we'll reuse in different areas. The background colors of flat black and then white smoke for the font color. And then the HTML itself, once again, just like the previous example, has a font size of 1.5 rem. Set the font family to Nanito, so that's all inherited. The body has 100 viewport units min height, and then is set to flex, and a column again. And then the header itself has a background color that's the header background color, and we set the basic color here. So we don't see a whole lot of difference, but I'm going to go ahead and launch this page now with live server and drag Visual Studio Code over to the left, and it looks like it launched the other page, so I'll need to change that. And then inside of here, I'm going to say /menu.html. Now right now, this doesn't look too great. We don't have a whole lot that looks good for sure. We have our Acme Co here, and then we've got our links here as well, and maybe a little something odd there. But now we'll start to apply some other styles. I'm going to do Control B again to hide the file tree, and we can start with that header title line. And if you remember, I believe that's what this is the button. We had the Acme Co H1, and then we had a button all inside of that section element that had the class header title line. So I'll put header dash title dash line, and we'll start to apply a few styles there. Let's give a padding of 0.25 rem on top and bottom, and 0.5 rem on the left and the right. We'll set it to a display of flex, and from there, let's go ahead and set the flex dash flow, and this will be a row instead of a column, and we'll say no wrap again. And then after that, let's justify the content, and we want space between. So we go hard left and hard right with the content we have, which should be the H1 and the button. I'll save this much, and we do see the change. So now we see a line over here that would be the button. We didn't really do much with it yet. And we've got our H1 over here. Okay, after our header title line class, let's get the next class, which was menu-button. This is the button itself, and I did use a button element, so we don't have to apply some other things, and it's great for accessibility, such as hitting the tab button. It will automatically get focus on a button element. If we used a div, for example, we'd have to put in a tab index, and there's some other advantages as well, but that's a big one. Okay, for the menu button, we'll say background-color, and now we'll set that to transparent because we don't want that normal button color that we get. And then we'll also set the border to none because buttons usually do come with a border. Now let's go ahead and give this some shape with a width of 48 pixels and a height of 48 pixels, which is kind of thumb size. I'll save this much, and we definitely see a change. It's gone. We don't see the 48 by 48 because we haven't done anything else with it yet at this point. But let's set the display to flex, justify content, and we want that center. We also want to align the items center, and I'll scroll just a little bit. And after that, we're going to set a position to relative. If you remember the position tutorial earlier in this CSS series, that means we're probably going to position something absolute inside of the button. But those are the button styles. And if we save, we really won't see a change at this point because we don't have anything inside of that button, and we've set it to be transparent. Okay, now we want the menu icon, which is the div inside of the button. But we're also going to select the menu-icon before pseudo element and the menu-icon after pseudo element. So all three of these will be affected by this. And we'll say background-color. Now let's use our variable, and we want the header color. It's that white smoke color that we defined above. Now here we'll set the width to 40 pixels, and we'll give this a height of 5 pixels. And then I'll go ahead and save so you can see what we have. We have one line essentially here, a big dash that's 40 pixels wide and 5 pixels high. So now let's go ahead and set the border radius, and we'll set that to 5 pixels. And now this is going to be position absolute. I'll scroll again for a little more room. And after that, we're going to go ahead and set our transition right here because it will apply to all of these. So we'll say all instead of any specific property, and then we want it to apply faster than we did in our examples, in just a half second. And we'll save that much. Now notice we only have the one line, and it does have the rounded edges, so it's one of the 3 lines we expect in our hamburger menu, but we applied this to all. So where are the others? Well, the quick answer is they're all stacked on top of each other right now, so we need to make a few more changes before we see them. The first change is just going to apply to the menu icon before and the menu-icon after, but not the menu icon itself. And here we just need to set the content to a blank, basically an empty quotes here, because if we don't do that, they won't be visible. So even though we didn't put anything in there, we need to set the content to empty value. And then we can go ahead and set the menu-icon before, and we're going to need to transform it now. So we'll say transform, and now we'll translate, and we're going to provide 2 values here. So I guess I could just do one first. Let's do translate y, and I'll show you why we need to do 2 values. So I'll say -12 pixels and save. And now look, they're not even up here at all. That is not what we want. So really it starts in the middle, and since this is 40 pixels, we need to have translate because the x value needs to be -20 pixels. And then the y value can be the -12 to put it up above the actual one that was in the middle defined by menu icon. So now when I save, it gets pulled back over, and I was expecting them to be the same length. Let me make sure I put everything that I thought I did, and I'll come back and go over that. But right now, two different lengths of lines. However, what I expected here did happen. We've got the minus 20 pixels to pull it back even, and the minus 12 pixels to put it on top. I'm going to select this now, do Shift Alt and the down arrow, and then change the before to after. And now I'll also need minus 20 pixels here, but now I'll need a plus 12 pixels to put this next one underneath and save. And now they have straightened out. That's what I needed, was the hamburger menu, all three the same. So the menu icon is the one in the middle, and then the top one is the before, and the bottom one is the after pseudo element. And now I know why it was longer before, because they were stacked on top of each other, but this bottom one started in the middle, which then made it look like it extended the middle line, which it was actually the two together, but not starting at the same place. Okay, from there, we can go ahead and apply some more styles to the nav. I'm going to scroll for some more room, and we'll select the nav element now. The nav element is going to start out with a display of none, but I'm going to go ahead and set up block here first so we can actually see what we're doing with the nav element, and then I'll come back and change it. We also want a transform-origin, telling the transformation where to start. And we want it in the top and center because it's going to drop down. And now we're going to apply an animation, but we haven't defined that animation yet. So let's go ahead and define it first. And underneath here we'll say at keyframes, and then we'll say show menu. And now we'll say at the 0%, we will transform, and then we want scale Y, and we'll set that to 0. And then after that, we want the next one to be at 80%. And that's going to also be a transform, and this will also be a scale Y, but this will be 1.2. Notice we don't have to just stop at 1, so it actually will go 20% beyond the intended size, and that's going to give it just a little bit of a bounce, like kind of like stretching a blind down and then letting go of the blind, and it snaps back up just a little bit. So then we'll say at 100% we'll use transform, and we'll say scale Y, and now we'll just put it back to 1, and then after it snaps back up it will lose that 20%. So let's save that, and that will be our show menu keyframes for how this transition will work. I'm going to come back to the nav, and again, like I said, change the display to none, and I'm also going to apply that animation. But right now we just want to see what we're doing and not really have the animation or have the nav hidden. So we'll go ahead and come back to both of those things. Right now we'll grab that unordered list inside of the nav. We'll say list style type, but not disk. We'll set that to none. And then we can set that unordered list to a display of flex. And then we'll set the flex flow there to column and no wrap. And after that, we can select the list items, so nav and li. And then we'll give them a padding of 0.5 rem all the way around. And let's put a border on top to 1 pixel solid. And here I'll need var so I can set that header dash color. Let's save this much and see what we've got. Well, we can see the menu is coming together. We haven't really styled the links or positioned these at all, but we now clearly have a menu that would drop down that has individual sections to it. So let's go ahead and style those links now. So after the nav li, we'll have nav, lowercase please, and the anchor tag. So all of the links will be display block instead of what they normally are, which is inline. And then we'll say text align and set them center. And then I'm going to give them a width of 80%. If I were to not be applying an animation, if I did not apply an animation to these links, then I would probably set them to 100% and just change the background color and the text link so they would take up the whole space. But because I want to apply an animation today, I'm setting these to 80% because the animation will make it grow. So that is the consideration there. And because of that, I'm also setting the margin to auto, so it will center these block elements that they are now block elements when they normally aren't. But what we get are centered links right now. We don't have an animation or a transformation, I should say, applied to any of these yet, but we will. After that, we'll go ahead and select the nav, we need the anchor, and there we go, the AnyLink pseudo selector, which is a pseudo class. So this applies to both the non-visited and visited links. And we'll say color, we'll set our var to the header color once again, so they stay that same color whether they've been visited or not. We'll set the font weight to bold and text decoration to none, and that will remove the outlines we have under those words. And now when we save, they're nice and bold, and they are that white smoke color that we expect them to be. And finally, let's go ahead and apply this transformation, which will animate the links just a little bit. So we'll say nav and then hover, and then we'll also apply this to the nav and if they have focus, both of those. We'll say transform, and now we can say scale, and we'll go to 1.2, which is essentially saying 120%, so they should grow 20%. And then we can set the transition right here as well. So I'll just say all 0.3 seconds, so we don't want to wait too long. And now when I mouse over, notice how they grow. And that works just great. And this will also happen if we tab through the page. You can see the outline, and this is good for accessibility. We'll select each one of these as we go through. So you do not want to remove the outline. You could change the colors or style it if you want to, but I usually leave it basically as the default. It does help with accessibility, so you definitely want it there so you can tab through these as well. Now let's go back to our nav menu and make those changes I talked about. So nav, instead of display block, should be none to start out. And then we also want to apply that animation, which will be animation using the shorthand here. So we'll say show menu, that's the name of the animation. 0.5 seconds is the duration. The default would be ease, so we could say ease or ease in and out. Again, I can't tell much of a difference between the two. And then we'll go with forwards, so it leaves it in that finishing state. As we noticed in our example before, the square changed to purple and stayed purple at the end instead of reverting back to green. So we'll say forwards here. Now, this won't apply a whole lot yet, but when I save, it will disappear. So now we need to do some other things so it will appear when we hover over the header or when we have focus anywhere in the header. I'll put these final styles right above the nav here in our CSS, and they're going to start with the is pseudo selector, which will save us a little space. I'm going to say header and then hover, but this will also apply to the header focus dash within. And now after that, we can specify the menu dash icon. So you can see what the is pseudo selector helped us with. Otherwise, we would have had to have said header, hover, menu icon, header, focus within, menu icon. So it saved us just a little bit. So what we're going to do, say background color, and we'll set that to transparent. And then we'll also go ahead and say transform. Well, let me hold off on the transform. I'll come back to the transform. Let's just go with background color transparent to start out with for the menu icon. And after that, I'm just going to select this and drop this down. Now remember, the menu icon itself is just this middle line, which means we'll be losing the middle line when we mouse over. Now after that, we'll say menu icon before. So now we're selecting just the top line. And instead of background color here, I'm going to want transform. And then I'm going to set a couple of things. One thing is the translate X, and that is because, remember, we already had to translate X back -20 pixels. We need to do this again, or it will end up in a different area. So we'll once again say -20 pixels for the translate X, and then we're going to rotate, and we'll rotate this line 45 degrees. And we'll leave it at that Now I'm going to select all of this and do Shift Alt and the down arrow again. I'm also going to press Alt Z just so you can see what isn't showing over there. So it's is header hover, header focus within, and then we're selecting the menu icon before. And now I'm switching this one to after. Once again, I need translate X minus 20 pixels, but now instead of 45 degrees, I need minus 45 degrees. Finally, I'm going to copy this one more time, select all of that down, but instead of the menu icon before or after, I'm going to switch this to the nav element itself. It's not a class, this is going to be the element, there we go. And now we need to change that display to block so it actually shows up, because before, remember, we had none. So those are the different changes we have made for when we hover over the header or when we have focus within the header, which is important if we're going to tab through. So now let me hover over the header, and you can see our hamburger menu changes to an X. And that's usually desirable. So the middle line disappeared. We set that background color to transparent. Then we rotated the other lines, the before and the after, so now they form an X. And of course, we also had to set this to display block for the menu to show. And now as I hover over these, that other transformation, of course, makes each one of the words grow by 20%, so we can tell what we're hovering over. And then likewise, if there's focus within here, now I remove this and it changes. So there we go. And we can see that little bounce at the bottom too. There we go. Now, maybe we want to set a background color on the nav itself, because I'm noticing that's bouncing a little bit lower and going into the white there. So let's go back to the nav and find where, oh, it was actually underneath here. So let's set a background color on the nav itself. And here we'll say var and grab that same header background color and save. Now let's check out the bounce with the menu. And yeah, now we see that color stays with this last word instead of dipping into the white there. That looks good. But there's one more transform that we can apply, and it's the one that I didn't before. This goes to an X, which is great, but let's apply this to the hamburger menu as well. So this is the menu icon, and right here we'll say transform, and now let's rotate, and let's do 720 degrees. So that's going to be a few full turns there, at least a couple. So now when I hover over, you get the spin, and then we have the X. And that's a nice little effect as well. So there, everything is complete. I hope this has helped you learn a lot about transformations, transitions, and even animations, because they're very useful, but you don't want to overdo it. Too many on a page can just be too much.